This is the story of a man who traveled halfway around the world to spread Christianity. Paul turned his back on everything he knew to embark on his mission. His life is the story of a remarkable transformation. He started out preaching hatred, then love. Initially, he attracted the wrath of the populace and of the powerful. He was made a pariah, persecuted, and threatened with death. Later, many of his enemies embraced Christianity. Paul turned a small Jewish sect into a world religion. Who was this man who risked death for his own beliefs? When Paul the Apostle was shipwrecked in the Adriatic Sea on his way to Rome, it marked the dramatic climax of a long and arduous journey. The Acts of the Apostles describes how the missionary fought for his life, but the account also contains a message of hope.
Not one of you will lose your life. Only the ship will be lost.
An angel, the New Testament text says, predicted that Paul would be saved by divine intervention.
And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land.
Here
in Malta is where the most significant rescue of a shipwrecked crew is said to have taken place almost 2,000 years ago. A storm washed Paul the Apostle ashore on what is now called St. Paul's Bay. In the 3 months that he had to wait here before continuing on to Rome, he managed to convert the whole island to Christianity. The Maltese are very proud that the island was converted to Christianity by Paul the Apostle himself. Even today, almost all the inhabitants of the island are Catholics. St. Paul is their patron saint. To this day, the most holy place for his worship is the Church of St. Paul in Rabat, outside Malta's former capital, Mdina. Beneath the church, there's a grotto where Paul is said to have lived after his shipwreck. Paul globalized Christianity. He turned a small Jewish sect into a world religion. How did he do it against all adversity? Who was this Superman of antiquity? That's what I want to find out. The search begins in Jerusalem. Pilgrims visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre all year around. Today, Christianity is the world's largest religion. It's easy to forget that the Christians were originally only one of many Jewish splinter groups, which could very easily have come to an early end with the death of its leader. His name was Yeshua, son of Joseph. We know him as Jesus of Nazareth. Few followers remained loyal to Jesus after he died on the cross. But soon after the crucifixion, there was talk of the resurrected one and the second coming. For Paul, such talk was heresy and blasphemy.
Paul was a very pious Jew, and like all pious Jews, he eagerly awaited the coming of the Messiah. This Messiah, however, was expected to be a powerful figure, and the assertion that Jesus was the Messiah was simply grotesque for Paul. To him, he was a madman and a rabble-rouser.
As a young man, Paul had come to Jerusalem from his hometown of Tarsus in modern-day Turkey. Today, he is also known by his Jewish name of Saul of Tarsus. There he had joined the Pharisees, a group of pious Jews. They believed that all Jews had to obey the 613 mitzvot, or commandments, without exception. In matters of faith, the young Paul was what we would today call radical, an extremist, a fanatic. deeply devoted to God, but with zero tolerance toward dissenters. As the growing group of Jesus' disciples soon realized, Paul and his group of deeply devout Jews knew no mercy.
For you have heard of my former manner of life in Judaism, how I used to persecute the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it.
The first Christian martyr was Stephen, a deacon in the early church who was stoned to death. It says in the Bible that Paul approved his killing.
Paul thought that Jesus was a pseudo-prophet who had predicted the downfall of Jerusalem, which didn't happen. That was blasphemy. And then he was involved in this lynching. But he saw in Stephen someone who faced death with an unbelievable inner clarity. He was positively radiant when he died. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that Paul was somewhat moved.
Saul the persecutor would become Paul the apostle. Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. The author of these deeply moving words in 1 Corinthians is the same man who persecuted the early Christians. How can that be? On one hand, he was a brutal fanatic, on the other hand, a sensitive poet who wrote some of the Bible's most beautiful verses. According to the Bible, the answer to how the brutal persecutor of Christians became an apostle who spread the gospel of Christ can be found on the road to Damascus.
As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?"
This is how Saul's conversion is described in the Acts of the Apostles.
I believe that Paul had a deeply existential experience on the road to Damascus, a personal experience. He encountered Christ, and that's what made him change his life radically. It wasn't because of some medical phenomena, some incidental experience, some random association, but because of something that touched him existentially.
Whatever happened on the road to Damascus, Paul was now convinced God had chosen him to go out into the world and speak to all people. Actually, an impossible mission, and a dangerous one. Immediately after his Damascus experience, Paul is said to have visited the Christian community in Jerusalem. There, he was notorious as a persecutor of Christians.
When he came to Jerusalem, he tried to stand by the disciples, but they were all afraid of him and did not believe that he was a disciple.
In a way, it was a tremendous presumption. Along comes this man who so far had been an adversary, but who now claims, "I am one of you," with no personal experience of Jesus, who may not even have known what Jesus even said as far as the disciples were concerned. But he claimed, "He appeared to me." And the question for them was, of course, is this person serious? Is he perhaps trying to spy on us? How could they know? He had to fight for his credibility.
Paul is said to have remained with the disciples for 15 days. He listened to their accounts of Jesus, his deeds and words. Now Paul wanted to take the message to the world, his God-given task. He saw this as his mission. Back then, the Roman roads were what freeways are today, the superhighways of antiquity. Paul took advantage of this. He covered more than 16,000 kilometers in 20 years, traveling halfway around the ancient world. Back then, as a missionary, you had to be a good walker. Traveling safely and quickly was possible thanks to the sturdy stone roads the Romans had built across their empire. To Paul the missionary, the network of roads must have seemed like a gift from God. His first destination was Antioch, already home to a small Christian community. But only those who were circumcised and adhered to Jewish dietary rules could belong to it. Paul wanted to evangelize as many people as possible.
Before Paul became a Christian, he believed that obeying God's law was a way of living according to God's will. But he suddenly realized this wasn't the point, that it was all okay because Jesus of Nazareth had ensured that God looked kindly at mankind. There was no need to try and please him, to follow certain rules, to gain God's favor. It was already guaranteed. And with that in mind, you could follow the law if you wanted, but you didn't have to.
The original church members viewed Paul's change of heart with concern. He was summoned to Jerusalem, where a crisis summit was held in 48 AD. Hardliners against liberals. The Christians of Jerusalem wanted to accept only Jews as members of their community. But Paul wanted Christianity to be open to all people. A compromise was found. Jewish Christians continued to obey Jewish laws, but Gentiles were exempt from them. To Paul, faith in Jesus was all that mattered. The Council of Jerusalem is a key moment in the history of Christianity. There, a new independent faith arose from Judaism that left its Jewish origins behind. The whole world was now open to the tireless missionary Paul. But he must have suspected that his path would be arduous and fraught with danger. His mission led Paul from Antioch to Ephesus. With over 150,000 inhabitants, it was the largest city in Asia Minor at the time. Everywhere he went, Paul encountered huge temple complexes. The ancient world was full of them. There was a temple for each of the many gods that people worshipped. But to Paul, sacrificing to many gods amounted to idolatry.
The people to whom Paul was appealing had a centuries-old tradition of worshiping gods. Society was divided into those who were free and those who were slaves, Greeks and barbarians, men and women. And then along came Paul, who said, that's not important. My God is important. The Christ who appeared to me is important. And he told the people that they should change their lives to serve him. That was a tremendous demand.
As Paul soon realized, how could he offend their religious sensibility? How could he demand they renounce all that was sacred to them for an unknown man who had been crucified?
Paul also provoked hostility, for example, by going to the synagogue and proclaiming his teachings, saying to the Gentiles, your faith is not the right one. It is inferior to the true faith that I represent.
Geringer zu schätzen als der wahre Glauben, den ich vertrete.
But his strategy often worked. Archaeologists made a spectacular find in a cave above Ephesus. Inscriptions suggest this was an early Christian pilgrimage site. In the center of the cave is one of the oldest representations of the Apostle Paul. Ephesus was once an important trade hub. Today, impressive ruins serve as a reminder of its former glory, as a port city that attracted people of all different backgrounds. But pilgrimage was even more important than trade. The patron goddess of the Ephesians was Artemis. She wears the testicles of sacrificed bulls around her neck, a symbol of the fertility of the goddess, who was revered as a nurturer of all living beings. Ephesus was the Lourdes of antiquity. Believers from all over the world made pilgrimages to the magnificent temple of Artemis to worship the goddess. The Artemis cult was already 1,000 years old in Paul's time and was tremendously popular not only in Ephesus. To compete with his crucified Messiah against Artemis and all the other gods in this stronghold of paganism, Paul must have had a lot of faith in God. The Acts of the Apostles relate how Paul made new enemies. This time they were merchants who sold miniature replicas of the goddess Artemis to pilgrims. They were unwilling to let Paul spoil their lucrative business and refused to tolerate any insult to their goddess. "You shall have no other gods before me," it says in Exodus. For Paul, believing in one God was all that mattered.
A
missionary lives dangerously. With his message of the one God of the Christians, Paul met with fierce resistance. Nevertheless, he is said to have stayed in Ephesus for 2 years, and he apparently succeeded in converting a number of men and women to this new faith that demonized all other gods. But Paul had even more ambitious goals. He wanted to bring his message to where monotheism was still unheard of, in the heartland of the Roman Empire on the European continent. Paul is believed to have reached Neapolis, today called Kavala, in northern Greece, in the year 50 AD. Paul would have passed this way. The Via Ignatia, dating back to Roman times, continued to be used into the 20th century, until asphalt roads were built. Paul's arrival in the port city of Kavala is still regarded today as the moment when Christianity began to sweep Europe. First of all, Paul needed a receptive audience. In Neapolis, he found it on a riverbank where he encountered a group of open-minded Jews. According to Luke's book of Acts, a woman named Lydia was the first to listen to Paul's words. With a baptism, the new sign of admission to the community of all Christians, Paul established the first church on European soil. The first Christian in Europe was a woman. Here in this little river, she's said to have been baptized by Paul. And there is much evidence that the wealthy and independent Lydia also became a church leader, perhaps even a bishop. But wasn't Paul the Apostle a misogynist? Today, Paul is often viewed as a woman-hater. He believed females should be silent in the congregation and subservient. So this is how he has gone down in history.
It's clear from Paul's letters that he knew women in leading positions and also appointed women to leading positions. At the same time, Paul was of course aware that the position of women in society was subordinate to men. And he also knew the parts of the Torah that were anti-feminist. According to Ecclesiastes, the Christian church, Christ did not distinguish between men and women, Jews and Greeks, people who were free and people who were slaves. To Christ, all were equal. This was an incredible message of equality and freedom.
So Paul was not the one-dimensional enemy of women as he has gone down in history. On the contrary, from his point of view, men and women cannot be anything other than equal. But the later church, which was dominated by men, didn't want to hear that, and still doesn't allow female priests, although the great majority of Catholics would certainly be in favor of that. Malta's St. Paul's catacombs deep underground bear witness to the appeal of early Christianity. Those who professed to be Christians were also promised eternal life. Paul and the early Christian community firmly believed in life after death, and this hope was associated with a particular kind of burial. Deep down in the earth, they built huge cemeteries, just like here in Rabat on Malta. Graves were carved into the soft limestone in seemingly endless corridors. To save space, there were several floors. Here, the deceased were buried wrapped in linen cloths. For Paul and the early Christians, these graves were only a stopover. They believed that they, like Jesus, would rise from the dead, not only the soul, but also the body. They firmly believed in eternal life, in an eventual reunion in paradise. That was the message and the great promise of early Christianity. Philippi was part of Macedonia at that time, one of the oldest and largest provinces in the Roman Empire. How would people here react to Paul and his promise of eternal life? So far, Paul had been in Asia Minor, in today's Turkey. How did the Greeks feel about religion?
Philippi was a city of many gods. Excavations have unearthed traces of many pagan deities. These were deities from Greece, Egypt, and Babylon, from all over the world.
Scientists have made interesting discoveries in the hills. Pictures carved in the rocks like a giant comic book. What are these pictures?
The inhabitants of the surrounding villages came here to fetch both cut and uncut stones to build their houses.
So, like a quarry.
This is the quarry. And as a thank you, they made these drawings here. It was a pagan custom.
A thank you in the form of art. What exactly do we see in these reliefs?
We see Artemis in all the pictures with a deer which she has killed. There were many hunters in Philippi. And Artemis, as the goddess of Ephesus, protects the hunters. Hence, these pictures here.
In spite of Artemis, Paul's message also found followers in Philippi. After his departure, he continued to keep in touch with the people of Philippi. Paul's epistles alone make up a quarter of the New Testament. His epistle to the Thessalonians is considered one of the earliest Christian documents.
Paul wrote his letters to the Christian communities, which he himself had founded. Once he'd left, he had to clarify the difference between his teachings and false teachings. These could give rise to misunderstandings. There were other apostles who spread a false gospel, in Paul's view.
Paul viewed himself as the sole authority. In his epistles, he laid out the definitive Christian doctrine. 7 of these can be attributed to Paul today. 6 others were probably written by pupils after his death and sent to the growing network of Christian communities. Each of the epistles was repeatedly copied, passed on, read, and discussed in an ongoing exchange, much like today's online social networks. This sophisticated letter system is similar to modern communications networks and contributed significantly to the spread of Christianity. Paul was a communications genius. His letters made him the key promoter of early Christianity. And thanks to Roman roads such as the Via Ignatia, they reached all corners of the empire. It's often said about Martin Luther that without the invention of printing, there would have been no Reformation. Similarly, without Paul's letters, there would have been no Christianity. But in Greece, the cradle of democracy, the letters weren't enough. Paul had to use his persuasive powers as an orator. The Acropolis temple complex was where Athenians worshipped Athena, patron and protector of the city, and dozens of other gods. Nowhere else was science as advanced, and humankind, the world, and the universe more thoroughly examined than in Athens. In Athens, Paul had arrived in the intellectual center of the ancient world, the city of philosophers, a place of lively debate. It was to be the acid test for his message, the gospel pitched against philosophy, a standoff that Paul would have preferred to avoid. On his missionary journeys, Paul had learned that he was most persuasive in personal conversation. But in Athens, he couldn't avoid having to speak before large audiences.
In ancient times, people were forever being addressed by speakers in public squares, in theaters, in houses, who were promoting some philosophy or doctrine or another and seeking to recruit followers. One of them was Paul, who was one of the most potentially effective. But this was not immediately clear. He was one of the many who presented themselves as representatives of a true, unique faith. It must have provoked people. It was attention-grabbing. But that's what he did.
Paul challenged the idea of many gods. In Athens, they were omnipresent. There were said to be 3,000 statues of the gods for 5,000 inhabitants. The Athenians sacrificed to their many gods very conscientiously. To be on the safe side, there was even a god without a name, the unknown god. They even made sacrifices to him, just to be sure that no deity had been forgotten. They would take some convincing to abandon this centuries-old practice. What did Paul have to offer them? Paul the Apostle spoke to the people at the Areopagus, traditionally the political center of Athens. It was a disastrous appearance. The Greeks saw Paul's message as untutored, blasphemous, and nonsensical. He preached the resurrection of the body. For the Greeks, this sounded like an ancient Egyptian mummy cult. Far from being able to convert them, Paul was scorned as a babbler, a charlatan. Athens was a bitter defeat for Paul. This city was crucial, but here he failed in his mission. His letters show that Paul began to doubt his abilities. As brilliant as he was as a letter writer, he lacked conviction as a public speaker. But Paul wasn't the type to give up fast. He resolved to do better at his next port of call, in Corinth. Corinth, the city between two seas. Its northern port linked it to Italy. The harbor in the southeast was considered the gateway to Asia. Due to its location, ancient Corinth was a flourishing commercial center. Everything money could buy could be found here. Corinth was the exact opposite of Athens. It was notoriously prosperous, a city where people flaunted their wealth and were greedy for more. It posed a different challenge. Paul did the last thing one might have expected. He looked for a job. Perhaps he took it as a sign from God that he came across Christians who were also tent makers, a craft he had learned in his hometown of Tarsus. This wide street must have been the main street of Corinth. Is this where Paul's workshop was?
It is the Cardo Maximus, the main street of Corinth, a splendid street paved with marble. To the left and right were shops. There were small holes in the facades of the shops. And that's where canopies were fastened, so that people were protected from the burning sun.
Unlike us, standing right in the sun.
Everything here was very expensive, so I can imagine that Paul's workshop wasn't here. It must have been a few blocks away. That's where he worked and lived.
But Paul certainly didn't come to Corinth to work and earn money. He came as a missionary.
Money didn't interest him at all. He came here because there were so many people living in Corinth. It was an international trade hub. The hundreds of thousands of people here lived from trade and business.
So tent maker was a perfect camouflage, allowing him to talk to people from all over the world.
Exactly. Travelers came here from Egypt, Britain, and the Black Sea. And these were the people Paul wanted to reach with his message. Because when they left Corinth, they would spread his message further.
Corinth became his city. Nowhere else was Paul so successful in converting people to the Christian faith.
There's this idea that Paul was a brilliant orator. We imagine he gave inspiring speeches and people came in droves. But that's not true. He gave this big speech on the Areopagus in Athens, which more or less backfired. He had been successful in his mission when he spoke to people in small groups, when he met them one-on-one. This was a successful long-term strategy. But we have to ask why exactly he was so extraordinarily successful. It's worth bearing in mind that paganism was somehow empty. It was very one-dimensional, very superficial. And Christianity was something that spoke to the soul. And that is what people were looking for at that time. And that is what Paul addressed in the one-on-one conversations he had with them.
But for Paul, it all meant nothing if he couldn't bring Christianity to Rome, the capital of the world at the time. While he was still in Corinth, he wrote a letter to the Romans announcing his arrival and laying out his theology in the clearest possible form. The Epistle to the Romans would be his theological legacy. The greatest impact of Paul's letter to the Romans was felt in the Reformation. Martin Luther is said to have been inspired by the line, "The righteous shall live by faith." From this, Luther concluded that man did not have to earn his place in heaven or buy it with money. For anyone who believes in Christ and repents of his sins, God has a place in heaven.
When you read the texts of Paul and Luther, you notice how similar they are. They are both incredibly sensitive. They understand how to reach people. At the same time, however, they can also get very angry when something goes against their basic principles. There are many sides to them. There's no filter, no separation between who they are and what they write. Their texts are an expression of them, completely unchecked. You get a sense of their great emotionality when you read their texts. And it's an emotionality that they share.
Wherever Paul went, he made the name of Jesus known. He established at least 13 churches, sowing the seeds of early Christianity, which only began to flower after his death. Christian communities were established in the most remote places, on cliff tops, and in caves deep underground. They all serve as a reminder of Paul the Apostle. First and foremost, Paul was a pioneer. He loved to chart new territory. Even though Asia Minor, Macedonia, and Greece were by no means completely evangelized, a start had been made. Paul then resolved to go west to Rome, perhaps even further to Spain. But first he had to report back to his original church in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, the successful missionary was received with suspicion. Paul saw himself as both a Christian and a Jew. But his visit to the temple, the holiest site in Judaism, sparked a scandal. In the Bible, it says that Paul was accused of taking a Gentile into the holy part of the temple complex and thereby desecrating it. A crime that was punishable in Jewish law by the death penalty.
Paul denies having made this mistake. It would be extraordinary if he had. But he was mistrusted by other followers of Christ who were more protective of the temple and didn't want it opened up to pagans, and by Jews who were skeptical of Christ, such as the Pharisees, the Sadducees. He encountered mistrust everywhere. The argument in Jerusalem used to discredit another Jew was that he was not abiding by Jewish rules, so it seems plausible that the accusation against him was fabricated.
Facing threats to his life in Jerusalem, Paul was taken into protective custody by a Roman officer. He was brought to Caesarea, seat of the Roman governor of the province of Judea. Paul was plagued by thoughts of death.
I long to go and be with Christ.
Back in Jerusalem, Paul saw himself surrounded by enemies and traps. The early church community resented him for converting non-Jews to Christianity. The Sanhedrin, the supreme Jewish council, wanted to silence Paul. And the Roman governor wanted to be rid of a potentially dangerous troublemaker. But Paul had an ace up his sleeve. He was not only Jewish and Christian, he was also a Roman citizen, subject to Roman law. But until the end, it remained unclear which law Paul had violated.
For a layman, the description of what happens after Paul's arrest is very confusing. It has to be said, of course, that Luke's account is highly dramatized. But reading between the lines, it's clear that there was a Roman citizen saying, "Hello, I am a Roman citizen. I have a right to be given a trial in Rome, and I appeal to the emperor, as is my right."
Paul is said to have spent another 2 years imprisoned in Caesarea. Only then would he be sent to Rome. Paul traveled to the city along the Via Appia. One of his privileges as a Roman citizen was that he was only under house arrest. He was even permitted to continue missionizing. The Roman Empire was home to a growing number of Christian churches. But Christians were still a tiny minority. The Holy Communion taught by Jesus Christ was celebrated in secret. They believed sacrifices to the Roman gods amounted to idolatry and forbade them.
They claimed that they belonged to the only true faith and were therefore exempt from ordinary cults. This meant that they could not participate in normal urban life. They weren't at public processions where neighbors would meet. They would say, "No, it's not for us." Nor did they participate in the imperial cult, and this aroused suspicion.
Suspicion that soon led to the first persecutions of Christians.
Punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men adhering to a novel and mischievous superstition.
No matter how humane the message of the early Christians might be, it was threatening for Rome. For whoever rejected the Roman gods also rejected the emperor, who had the status of a god. So what became of Paul? The Acts of the Apostles end here. None of the Gospels describe how Paul died, but we know that his struggle for Christianity ended in bloodshed. Most research relies on the so-called Acts of Paul from the 2nd century. Even if we don't know the exact year of his death, we know that Paul was most likely executed around 60 AD. A column in the church of Trefontane is said to be where he was bound when he was beheaded with a sword. This would have been his final privilege as a Roman citizen, saving him from an agonizing death on the cross. Paul did not live to see Christianity become the world's largest religion.
Paul developed a theology that picked up on Roman and Greek traditions and the religious and cultural ideas of his time. But the crucial thing is that he brought a new message into the world. That is what made Christianity attractive on a global scale.
Daraus ging die Attraktivität des Christentums hervor.
This new message had to do with the freedom and equality of all people before God in Jesus Christ. He introduced a promise of freedom to the world, and since then, it's impossible to imagine the world without it.
Freiheitsversprechen war in der Welt und ist seither nicht mehr wegzudenken.
His missionary journey took him across almost the entire Roman Empire, founding churches and spreading Christianity. Paul the Apostle made Christianity a world religion. His life is straight out of an adventure novel. He's said to have been shipwrecked 3 times. He was persecuted, threatened with death. But his story is also one of a remarkable transformation. From fanatical persecutor of Christians to the actual founder of Christianity. Who doesn't know the verse? And now these 3 remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. A beautiful message, and one that you don't have to be a Christian to appreciate.
Man muss kein Christ sein, damit sie einen erreicht.